Good afternoon, and welcome to a webinar on own-label distributor responsibilities hosted by EAS Consulting Group and presented by EAS independent consultant Bruce Elsner. EAS specializes in FDA regulatory matters with a prime focus of assisting domestic and foreign food, pharmaceutical, dietary supplement, medical device, cosmetics, and tobacco firms comply with applicable laws and regulations. EAS is staffed with former FDA compliance and inspection officials and industry executives and is assisted by an extensive network of consultants with many years of FDA and industry experience. Today's presenter is Bruce Elsner. Bruce is an expert on CGMP compliance and quality assurance systems for dietary supplements, cosmetics, and OTCs. He assists an international client base with CGMP assessments, improving manufacturing processes, developing quality assurance systems, and conducts CGMP training, drafts responses to FDA warning letters and consent decrees, and conducts QA capability and CGMP compliance assessments at manufacturing plants. As a reminder, during the webinar, you may ask any questions by typing them into the questions box. And with that, I will say thank you again for joining EAS, and I'll turn the presentation over to Bruce.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to be able to share some information on responsibilities of own-label distributors with you, and I hope you find this interesting and informative. The first question here we begin with is, are you an own-label distributor? Just what is an own-label distributor? So an own-label distributor could have that title, or it could have the title of a private label distributor, or a virtual company. They're essentially all the same in the eyes of the FDA, who commonly refers to all of those as own-label distributors. This presentation will deal with both those requirements related to dietary supplements as well as OTC drug products. Applies to companies in all those areas. So the question really is what defines your company as an own-label distributor? Well, it's simply that if your company manufactures, contracts out manufacturing or packaging or labeling, typically called by someone called a co-packer, laboratory testing, warehousing, and distribution, and you do that on your behalf for your product for distribution to a consumer, then in the eyes of the FDA, you are referred to as an own-label distributor. Those who are doing this work for you hereafter we'll refer to throughout the slides as CMOs or contract service providers. So here's a key issue that we need to talk a minute or two about. The concept of how own-label distributors work with their contract service providers in the past has been a very informal often, and on a basis that wasn't well understood by the own-label distributor. And it was often referred to as a turnkey relationship, where the own-label distributor felt everything was fine as long as they had an agreement that what this contractor was going to do for them, and they would do it all, and the own-label distributor really didn't have to do anything except sell the product. And that, of course, is now no longer a viable approach to take with contract manufacturers. To explain that in clear terms, the FDA in almost all warning letters to dietary supplement manufacturers now includes comments like this. I'm going to read a couple of these word for word. Don't typically like to do that, but each word in here is quite important. Your firm has the ultimate responsibility to ensure that all phases of production of those products are in compliance with CGM requirements under 21 CFR 111. Same thing applies to 21 CFR 211 for drug products. Although your firm may contract out certain operations, it cannot contract out its ultimate responsibility to ensure the dietary supplement is not adulterated for failure to comply with dietary supplement CGMP requirements. That last phrase, not adulterated for failure to comply, is a very significant phrase, because when and if the FDA does decide that you have been in non-compliance with the CGMPs, they can and do declare your products to be adulterated, all of them, not necessarily whether there's any problem found with any one product. And that's a major issue, because at that point, if they do that, you will be stopped from shipping any product. They go on to say in another way, the distributor that contracts with other manufacturers, et cetera, do this. Your firm has the obligation to know what and how these activities are performed so that you can make decisions related to whether your products conform to established specs and whether to approve and release the products for distribution. Again, the last part of that statement, confirming that the product meets specifications and whether you may approve it for distribution. Very significant because that is your final responsibility to approve it for distribution. So that takes us to what do you have to do to meet your own label distributor responsibilities. Well, there are basically 4 key areas. There's a lot of content under each one of these. We'll hit the highlights of each as we go through the presentation, simply because to get into all the details associated with every one would be more than could be covered in the time period allowed. But we'll do our best to cover the most significant issues you need to understand. Qualify the contract service provider. In other words, you should not be doing business with a contract service provider, a CMO, or even a distribution facility if you use them, if you haven't qualified them. And we'll talk about how to do that later. We recommend that you establish a quality agreement with your contract service provider, your CMO, that really establishes all of the responsibilities. And we'll cover that also in more detail briefly. Meet your OLD's quality unit responsibilities. You, as an own-label distributor, are required to have a quality unit, and you need to understand and comply with the responsibilities for your quality unit. And finally, you need to establish a process for monitoring on an ongoing basis the contract service providers or providers that you're using. And you need to have evidence that you're doing that monitoring. So we'll begin with qualifying your CMO, contract service provider. Commonly, it has been done historically that companies have sent self-assessment questionnaires to their contract service provider. It's now been made clear by the FDA that while it's okay to use such a thing as a self-assessment questionnaire, by itself, it is no longer considered adequate. So self-assessment questionnaire is fine, but it needs to include some of these other elements as well. Initial CGMP compliance audit conducted by your own quality person, if properly qualified to do that, or many times in the case of an own-label distributor, it's done on their behalf by a third-party auditing organization. You also need to qualify the C of A data that they will be providing to you on your each product lot. That means you may not use that C of A data if you have not first qualified it. We'll discuss that later also. Then you need to periodically requalify that C of A data to know that it continues to be reliable. And in your program for qualifying service contract providers, you'd want to provide for the status of assigned status as qualified, conditionally qualified, disqualified, or requalified as is warranted by how you're working with them. Let's take a look at what we've mentioned briefly, having a quality agreement. The quality unit responsibilities required throughout 21 CFR 111-211 must be assigned either to the own-label distributor, yourselves, the contract service provider, CMO, or in many cases, they're going to be shared responsibilities. Some of the topics that you need to be including will be these listed on the next 2 slides. The specific details for all but the first 3 bullet items here are most clearly documented in a table illustrating which party has each responsibility and which responsibilities are shared by you and your CMO. So naturally, you would include things like the scope of the agreement, the terms of the agreement, effective dates, etc., confidentiality, non-disclosure requirements by both parties, detailed assignment of the quality unit responsibilities, and key document approvals and document sharing. That document sharing piece is sometimes a sticking point with some contract manufacturers who sometimes claim they're not comfortable with releasing and sharing documents with you, and that's a bit hard to understand since they're making your product according to those documents. But it is necessary that that be clarified. And then, of course, the product release issue needs to be spelled out clearly in such a quality agreement. In addition, any review of deviations or out-of-spec findings need to be included in this quality agreement, how they'll be handled. Generation of data to support expiry dates or best used by dates if you are using them on your products. Access to facilities, that seems obvious, but many contract manufacturers are very carefully guarding how and who people come and visit them. So that needs to be clearly understood up front. Notification of regulatory inspections. In other words, you need to know, and you have to have them agreeing to let you know as soon as there may be a regulatory inspection by the FDA or even state authority, and that any observations that are made and responses that they make to those observations needs to be clarified that they will be providing those to you. If there's any need to resolve disputes, that needs to be explained how that will be done, and signatories need to be identified, key personnel, and quality unit representatives of both parties, and there may be some other topics you want to include. So that will take us to talking about the responsibilities of the quality unit, which commonly would be referred to as QA or QC. By the way, the FDA in their regulations always uses only the term QC to mean any aspect of a quality unit, quality assurance, quality control. It could be in a small company as a single person or shared roles, but it's referred to as quality unit generally in the FDA language, or quality control. They use those terms interchangeably. So you need to document those quality responsibilities that are spelled out in the GMP regulations, 21 CFR 111 and subpart F for that, and 21 and 211.22 for drugs. You need to approve all the GMP related documents, and they include SOPs that you need to have in place governing your own label distributor operations. Needs to have approvals for specifications, and those specifications that you'd be most concerned with are those that have to do with specifications for dietary and non-dietary ingredients and active pharmaceutical and excipient ingredients that may be unique to your product. And I'll say why we're talking about unique to your product. In other words, if that's not something that the contract manufacturer is presently dealing with, you'll be needing to create these specifications, and they'll need to indicate that they're yours and you've approved them. Same thing for primary packaging materials and labeling that may be yours alone and unique to you. In any product specifications, of actual bulk product and packaged product specifications absolutely are your responsibility to establish and approve. And the same thing is true for official formulations for your products. Now, it's understood, of course, that many times you're going to be working in collaboration with your contract manufacturer to establish these specifications, but it doesn't negate the need for you to be the approver and to be functioning as the issuer of these that we've just discussed. Others may require joint approvals. So approving other documents would include master manufacturing and master packaging records. These absolutely need to show evidence of your approvals. They're your product, and you can't be using a master manufacturing record that doesn't have any reference to your approval on them. Final release of the product for distribution is a responsibility for documenting that. Same thing for establishing the expiration or best used by date intervals. In other words, you need to determine and notify your contract manufacturer officially what is the interval that you're authorizing for that product. Is it good for 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, whatever you may decide to be using, if you are using expiry or best use dates at all. Material reviews, which is another term for investigations and formal reports for non-conformance issues. they must be reviewed and okayed by you and as a final report. And same thing for change control. Any changes that are made and need to be made in the way a product is manufactured, packaged, controlled, needs to be documented formally in an approved change control process that needs to be in place. And the documentation of that, you must have received a record of that from your CMO and review and approve it or okay it to say, yes, we see that and we're okay with it, and that would be kept in your files. Product complaint investigations and the final report also needs to be reviewed and approved by you as a known label distributor. And you need to maintain evidence of the quality unit review and approval and endorsement of basically all these documents that we just mentioned. You also need to ensure maintenance of product distribution records and ongoing monitoring of the CMO. And also you have to demonstrate that you have an approved quality agreement, which we recommend. Again, it's not an absolute requirement, but the FDA is currently asking dietary supplement and certainly drug companies, do they have a quality agreement with their contract manufacturers? Let's talk for just a brief moment about training, because it has to do with whether you've got properly qualified people in your operations. For an own label distributors, facility and operations we're talking about here, having a training program. And there should be a training requirements list or a matrix for each job category within your organization. You want to include GMP training and SOP training, because you'd be expected to have a set of SOPs governing your operations at your facility. Also, any job-specific skills training that would be associated with if you're doing any packaging, warehousing, laboratory, and distribution services, certainly you'll be doing some of, if not all of those. And there need to be complete training records on file to show that your people have been trained, the training is current, and they are therefore properly qualified to be functioning in the roles that they're assigned. Let's talk a little about the basic considerations for SOPs. Pretty much a routine and not anything too difficult to grasp, or not typically something you'd be doing, but they need to be covering all the appropriate CGMP compliance requirements in the CGMPs that apply to your operations at your facility. It doesn't mean that this is not talking about all the SOPs that would be in place at your contract manufacturer. We're talking here about those that would be in place for you at your facility based on your operations. So they'd be applying to things done at the product owner or corporate level, however you define that. They show ownership of that function, that document, and the approval of that document. They would deal with, as we said, oversight and monitoring of contractors. And minimally, they would include basically all the topics that we're covering in this presentation. SOPs should be written in a way that includes clear how to do content. Many times SOPs are much more like policy statements, and they really don't serve a good purpose if they're done that way. They should be describing how those particular responsibilities are to be conducted. And if they're done that way, they will serve as effective training documents. We need to talk about specifications. There are those that are created and need to be created and approved by you as a known label distributor. Others are initially created by the contract manufacturer, and we'll differentiate between those. Those that would be required to be created by you would be for ingredients unique to the own label distributor's product, the product owner, your product. So any ingredients unique to your product, in other words, not presently in use at the contract manufacturer, you would need to be making sure that that specification is developed and approved by you. Same thing goes true for bulk and packaged product labels and labeling. Specifications for those need to be created and approved by your folks. Primary packaging materials unique to the OLD. In other words, if we're talking about a unique cap or a unique bottle or jar or blister pack or whatever it may be, if it's something the contract manufacturer is not using and you're requiring this to be used for your product, then you need to develop that specification, approve it, and provide it to the contract manufacturer or packager. Now, there are many cases, of course, where specifications that you need to control the manufacturing and packaging of your product might initially be created by the contract manufacturer because they're using these things in their own day-to-day operations. So ingredients commonly used by the CMO and is in their inventory, they would typically have a spec already established for those ingredients. The same thing for packaging materials if they're presently in their inventory. However, there needs to be some evidence that they're not only approved by the contract manufacturer, but there has to be evidence that you have reviewed them and are satisfied that they're okay for use for your product. And that okay by you should be documented on each copy of those kinds of specifications and kept on file at your location. And of course, you need to be aware that the contract manufacturer is not using or moving to the next step anywhere in the process where they haven't made sure the specs governing that particular step have been met. In other words, you may not proceed to the next step in any manufacturing or packaging operation where the required specifications have not been met. And sometimes is a violation by contract manufacturers in this interest of efficiency, and they say they're willing to take the risk, but the risk may be greater than they know if the FDA comes in and cites them for that, and you may find yourselves having an interruption in your product supply. So you need to make sure that they are honoring that. What about master manufacturing records? First of all, they're almost always going to be written in collaboration with your contract manufacturers because they're the ones who know how to do this. Often you do not have that detailed information within your own organization. The ingredients specifically must be identified. The amounts calculated from approved formulations. All key processing steps described. The yields required at key process points must be included in the master manufacturing record. And this master manufacturing record, because it would have probably been initiated by your contract manufacturer, it must be co-approved by them and you, the quality units minimally of both organizations. And copies of these showing your approval must be in your corporate offices or however you refer to your own label distributor company's offices. Same thing holds true for master packaging records. These are often separate documents from the master manufacturing record. That's commonly how they're done. Just be aware that when you ever go back to look at the regulations, the master manufacturing records referred to in the regulations assumes that it's addressing the full scope of manufacturing and packaging records. So you often will find, and it's most commonly done, that master packaging records are separate from master manufacturing records. Again, written in collaboration with the contractors, all packaging materials specifically identified, all key packaging steps described. Sometimes that's a question, what in the world do we put in a master packaging record? Well, there are things that should be in there. Think about how you would be instructing a brand new employee to how to work on and run a packaging line. Those kinds of instructions need to be in the master packaging record. Label usage reconciliation must be provided for in the master packaging record if there is not 100% electronic label verification. That's usually not the case, but if you happen to have electronic verification online that inspects every label going down the line, for not only that there is a label, but that label is the correct label, then you don't need to do label usage reconciliation, but otherwise you must. Yield must be required and is required, and it must be documented and included in the master manufacturing record in terms of an allowable percentage of theoretical yield. This document would also be co-approved by both the product owner, yourselves as the own label distributor, as well as the contractor. And copies, again, must be maintained at your corporate offices. Now let's talk about what obviously follows from that, and they're the individual batch production records. There's just a few items here, but they're very important. they, first of all, must be a true replica of the master manufacturing record. That master manufacturing record, excuse my scratchy throat, allergies I think are catching up with me. But anyway, those master manufacturing records have been approved by all the proper people. And that means that it's from those approved documents that you will create the working documents. So if any actual batch production records slip into the system because people have made changes in a different database where they happen to keep them, which they should not, and they end up getting different versions of production records out on the floor, that's a serious problem. And for you, it will indicate that they're doing things that you don't know about if you're not looking very carefully at the individual batch records. We'll cover that in a minute. Anyway, they must be true replicas of the approved master. All key process steps must be double verified and must be, so that means done by, approved by. But sometimes still in this current day and age, we find own label distributors and contract manufacturers are not doing that. They maybe only have one person initialing for something having been done. That's not okay. All entries also must be real time. I only put this here to mean that you need to make sure through various processes of monitoring and auditing them that you know they are operating that way. Because if your contract manufacturers are not very disciplined about how their people are executing these batch production records, and they're not doing it real time, somebody is saying they did this and they put the whole morning's work down as to having been done, either before it's done or after it's done, and the same thing with verifying that these things were done, and it's not real time, and that were to be discovered by the FDA, for instance, that's a falsification of records. It happens to be a criminal offense. So you want to make sure that that's not happening in your contract manufacturing operations. Yields at key points in the process are required and must meet allowable ranges, and that's going to be calculated and documented on the individual batch record. And then it's going to be this individual batch production record, as they're putting into the system, obviously will be issued by the contractor. And from time to time, you'll be requesting copies of those. We'll cover that in a minute. If your product does require is labeled with an expiry date or a best used by date, you need to have supporting stability data for that. Understand, of course, that having such a date at all is voluntary, but if you do, it's voluntary for dietary supplements, that is, it's mandatory for drug products. If you do have an expiry date, you've got to have supporting stability data from a formally established stability protocol. And examples of ones commonly endorsed by the FDA, the ICH, International Council of Harmonization, Q1A, Revision 2, or FDA guidance document on drug products applicable to any of this. And for dietary supplements, there's some freedom to what kind of a protocol you may use. It would resemble this, but it may be a little bit more lenient or less stringent, but it needs to be established as a formal protocol for dietary supplements. They typically will have accelerated testing so that you can project at an earliest possible time the end expiry date if you're using one. And if you do, the FDA expects it to be based on 6 months of accelerated studies. Many times people are using a minimum of 3 months to project that date. It's not recommended, and apparently it's not a key point in the FDA enforcement activity, but they do recommend 6 months, although it's not unusual for companies to document it or determine it based on 3 months. Continue the room temperature testing to confirm declared expiry period throughout the life of the product. And one that is to confirm the expiry period for those tests that were put on those products that were put up on tests to determine this. But then thereafter, as long as you're producing that product, you need to put at least one lot on test of each product during the entire product life. So if you're having a product on sale for distributing for 3, 4, 5 years, you'd be doing at least one lot of each product throughout the lifetime of that product. And that dating interval that you've assigned and communicated to your contract manufacturer must be approved by your quality unit. Let's talk a little bit about deviations in quality and how they get addressed. It's handled in FDA dietary supplement regulations by what is called material reviews. Material reviews is just another name for a formal investigation and report that needs to be issued under certain circumstances. It's done by the contractor for many of these situations because typically most of them, not all of them, but most of them will occur in the manufacturing and packaging operation or the testing operations at their own laboratories or at their contract laboratories. So often it will be the contractor who is initiating these, but not in all cases. It's a formal investigation report and it must be kept on file and made, and a copy of it must be in the batch folder related to those particular lots of product that may have been involved. When is a material review required? It's required for any out-of-spec laboratory result. And that means the laboratory who's done the work must determine whether that result can be nullified because they can understand exactly why it happened, or if not, that it is a valid result. And when there is a valid result, out-of-spec result finding for a raw material or a product, that means there's a confirmed product or material nonconformance, the other condition that requires a material review. Also, if there's a deviation discovered from what the batch production record called for, that deviation could have been accidental or it could have been deliberate because of some emergency. When that is done, it needs to be handled by a deviation, by a material review, unless it was clearly reviewed and okayed as a deliberate deviation well in advance of actually having implemented it. So this material review is when a deviation occurs as an unintended deviation. Also, if there's an unusual event, a material review is required. To be extreme in this, you could have a fire in the warehouse, and that could create all sorts of problems. Anything, we had one client had a extermination had to be done in the warehouse, and no material review was conducted. That kind of thing would require a material review, any unusual event. Any significant calibration issue that's found. In other words, any controlling devices or scales or balances that were found to be significantly out of calibration requires a material review. And for any and all product that is returned, that requires material review. This does not mean any product samples that were returned as a result of a product complaint after a customer used the product. This is for product that is returned basically as was distributed, and for some reason it was returned, either it was not what was ordered, or it was overstock, or it was whatever it may be, and you've authorized the return. That requires a material review. The report requires the contractor quality unit approval and the product owner quality unit to be notified and copied, and the final report to document that the product owner, that is you folks, your quality unit has okayed the material reviews. Those material reviews need to be on file at your location. So having gone through all of these things dealing with making and packaging and controlling your products, this takes us to the question of what conditions must be met to get the product from your CMO to you. Well, first of all specifications must be met. And by the way, this authority to ship finished product from your contract manufacturer to you or to your distribution facility, if a 3PL is used, can and may be delegated to your contract service provider. That's not to distribute product to customers, it's to distribute product to you or your distribution facility. All specifications must be met, should not be shipped in quarantine status. This is something the FDA doesn't come down hard on, and although it's done very commonly, but your expectation of your contractor, and it should be established that you want product to have met its specifications before it leaves their facility. If it has to be shipped in quarantine status for on rare occasions, we probably all know that that does happen. It should be, if not rare, very seldom that is permitted. And when it does, there should be records that it was sent and records that the destination receiver, how they and when they were notified that the product was finally approved. Formal authority may be delegated to the contract manufacturer, just mentioned. Final batch folder, QA approval checklist goes to product owner, quality unit, and the distributor if you're using a C3PL. What in the world does this mean? Well, some document should be set up. Normally, the most convenient thing is to do it as a checklist that says, these are all of the documents that should be in the batch folder associated with the making, controlling, packaging of that product. And it should establish that all these documents are there because a quality person is going to be doing this, reviewing that batch folder, making sure they're all there, that all those documents are properly executed, and based on them all being there, including the batch record, including test results, including the final certificate of analysis they're issuing, any material reviews that should be there, and there could be a list of up to 10 different kinds of documents. They've all been reviewed and found to be properly executed and as they should be in terms of content. On the basis of that, and it's really only on the basis of that, that the quality person can make the decision that that batch is suitable for approval or release from the contract manufacturer to you. So this will be issued by the contractor, this approval to ship, and a copy of the C of A, the batch folder quality approval checklist, or whatever name you call that, must be maintained by the product owner, quality unit. That's your evidence that that product was made, controlled, packaged, tested, and approved as it should have been. And it's the basis on which you can say it's okay for us to accept and distribute the product. So let's talk about when it reaches you, how do you release it? First of all, it is vitally important that you understand that only you as the product owner are authorized to release product for distribution to your customers. That may not be done by any of your contract service providers, even a contract distributor that you may be using if you are using one of those. So you and you only are responsible for releasing each lot of each product for distribution to your customers. Vitally important, and it's very often misunderstood and not being done, and it's a significant violation. This final release by you for distribution must be based upon the receipt of properly documented C of A from the contract manufacturer packager, the approved batch folder quality checklist, which you just discussed, sometimes people have thought that if a C of A comes along with an approval on it, that meets the need. No, it doesn't. It requires having reviewed all of the documents associated with that production, to the production of that product, as described earlier. The product receipt acceptance document created by the quality unit or from the distributor. That means you need to create an acceptance document that says this product has been received, it is what it's supposed to be, and we accept it as being the correct product because you've had all the documentation associated with it that's required. And we also recommend that you do an inspection of that product, a sampling inspection, and compare it to a product standard. So what does that mean? It means you should be physically looking at the product that came in. And that means that if you're expecting a tablet to come in packaged in a certain kind of bottle, and that product should be a white capsule, and it comes in and it's in a different kind of bottle, and it's not a not what it's supposed to be, not a weight tablet or capsule, but a maybe has a tan or a cream color or something. It doesn't look like what it's supposed to look like, nor maybe the package looks what it's supposed to look like. So by doing that comparison, that's the last step you can do to reasonably say, okay, we've gotten the product that we expect to get. We have evidence that it's approved, and it is by visual inspection and review of those documents, it is okay for us to release, to do what we're going to do with it, and then ultimately release it for distribution. That product owner, your own label distributor, review and approval release document must be issued. In other words, you have to document the approval of each lot of product that comes in. That is what it's supposed to be, and you are releasing it ultimately for distribution. Distribution may not occur without that formal quality unit release. Just a simple comment or two about records for product distribution. There's very rarely any problem with this, but just to quickly go over it, it'd be maintained by the product owner, you as an own label distributor. Full and specific documentation must be created and kept on file to allow for lot traceability. And it must obviously include the product name, item number, lot number, quantities of each lot of product distributed, the name and address of the customer. And that information needs to be maintained for purposes of product recall or some other investigations or follow-up that you may need to do, but particularly as appropriate to conduct a reasonably adequate product recall if it were to be required. It's also used when, from time to time, you'd be expected to conduct mock recalls. In other words, you test your ability to conduct a recall. Let's talk a minute or two about reserve samples. There's often confusion about who collects and keeps reserve samples. The answer is both parties, the contract manufacturer and yourself as the product owner, own label distributor. Both organizations are expected to have reserve samples of every lot of product that is being released. The storage conditions for those reserve samples must be the same or be consistent with the product label. In other words, if your product label doesn't have any particular requirements for storage, that's the easiest of all. Typical ambient conditions is okay, but if it says controlled room temperature, then that has very specific definitions. If it says keep cool or avoid excessive heat, that has requirements defined in the USP for what those terms mean. Those reserve samples need to be kept where those conditions are met. The container enclosure system used for those reserve samples must be the same as the product that was distributed. And that's typically the case because typically the reserve samples are the actual retail units. But in some cases, if you're shipping out bulk product, then the requirement is that you use reserve sample containers that are equivalent to in structure, cap, bottle, etc., as the material of the bulk container that you ship that product out in. You must retain the reserve samples for 1 year past the shelf life expiry date if you're using those dates, or 2 years from the date of distribution of the last batch associated with the reserve sample. And we need to discuss a little further the important topic of ongoing monitoring of your contract manufacturers. So by product owner, these records need to be, this monitoring needs to be done by the product owner. Quality unit typically may involve some operations folks as well. It needs to include some of what we've mentioned before, and some of this is reiterating it, but it's important to have this clear. Copies of all specifications on file. In other words, you should know what specifications are controlling the materials and the products that you're making, and you should have copies of them all on file. Copies of all master manufacturing, master packaging records, and formulations. The formulas that are being used to create your product need to be on file. Periodic sampling of batch records, packaging records. And this is so that you can confirm that your contract manufacturer has not started doing things differently than they were doing when you last confirmed that everything was what it should be. We recommend doing something like sampling throughout the year, perhaps once a month, batch records for each of your products. There should be on-site periodic audits with audit reports generated. They can be by you, by third party, sometimes substituting FDA inspection reports, but you need to have some ongoing evidence of audits, not just one initial one and then never done again for as long as you work with the contractor. Evidence of the product owner quality unit review. In other words, you must have your quality person be reviewing and approving or accepting all of the above documentation and keeping it on file, showing the review by initials and dates on those documents in your file. A little bit about product complaints. They can be received from any source. It's recommended and expected you would have a complaint log maintained, established and maintained. You need to document the decision whether an investigation is required or not. You need to send a potential quality manufacturing CGMP compliance issue to the contract manufacturer. In other words, if it has something likely to have to do with how they've handled their end of making your product, you need to forward that for them to participate in the investigation and report. These should be concluded within 30 days. The final report to include the CMO's report, and you must, as a product owner, prepare and sign off on all of the final reports and keep them on file, obviously. And if there's an alleged serious adverse event, that is a serious medical event, it could cause death, hospitalization, or medical attention to prevent either of those, that must be immediately reported to the FDA using their MedWatch program. And one final thought, that if your contract manufacturers or you are using computer systems to assist in any of this CGMP compliance, those computer systems, the functions within them upon which you're relying, must be validated or verified, and that must be documented. Otherwise, you must be using all paper systems to document your compliance. And one brief comment about other things that typically will show up during an FDA inspection of own-label distributors is they will either beforehand, during, or after the inspection, they will typically be looking at your labeling, your promotional brochures and advertising, and your websites. So you need to be sure that they are all in compliance in terms of content, claims, ingredients allowed, etc. Because they will be looking at those, and they are very commonly the site of commonly cited on FDA warning letters. Okay, so that concludes the presentation formal part of it. I'll be happy to entertain any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Bruce. We do have a number of questions coming in. The first question is, would a finished product specification that contains required specifications from both parties associated with formula, manufacturing, and packaging that is then approved and signed by both parties be equivalent to having an MMR or MPR on record?
No. That means substitute an MMR on record in lieu of a product specification, no, that is not adequate at all. Because the specification for a product will include requirements for specific kinds of testing. And that will be identification of the concentrations of dietary ingredients, for instance, that are in the finished product. They also require most commonly microbiological testing of the product, and none of that is part of what's in a master manufacturing document.
Okay, thank you. Our next question is, contract manufacturers may not be willing to share some proprietary manufacturing steps, such as blend times, order of additional ingredients. Is it acceptable for the OLD to have redacted MMRs and MPRs on file?
That is a common and very ticklish question. The FDA has, on a couple of occasions, taken a position that if they're not willing to share those kinds of documents with you so that you can confirm they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and if you're not visiting them often enough to confirm that yourself, then it's a problem that they're not willing to share those documents with you. If they redact all the things they don't want you to see, you're not going to be able to do your job of knowing that they're making the product the way you're supposed to. You should try very hard to get them to share documents, and if they have to redact anything, redact as little as possible. It's not an ideal situation at all. It may mean you're going to need to visit them more frequently to just spot check on certain things. But the FDA has, I may have said that already, has gone on record saying if you have contract manufacturers who claim everything they're doing is proprietary, and by the way, I personally have seen many cases where contract manufacturers claim proprietary operations and they're not proprietary at all. So sometimes it's just a way to avoid providing you what you're requesting. So I would press hard on that. And short of that, I would recommend that you get a document from them saying, we will not be providing those documents because of such and such. And usually they'll say something like they are available for inspection at our facility. I'm not guaranteeing you that the FDA will be satisfied with that.
Okay, thank you. Our next question, how do we handle finished product that goes from the CMO directly to a distributor or to a retail warehouse?
It can't go directly to a retail warehouse because then it's no longer under your control, first of all. If it goes to a third-party distributor, what's typically called a 3PL, third-party logistics organization, they need to be doing the same kind of thing as if it was being sent to you. They need to accept that product by the same approach I described as if you were accepting it. That it came in as described, it looked like it was supposed to look. They need to document the receipt and approval of it for them to go on and do their distribution function. But keep in mind, that distribution facility may not distribute that product without your approval for each lot. You cannot delegate distribution authority of each lot to the contract distribution facility.
Are these regulations applicable to topical OTC and cosmetic type products that are not considered OTCs?
Not to cosmetic products, but yes, any OTC product, whether it's a topical or not.
Would a certificate of compliance in addition to the COA, would a COC in addition to a COA be acceptable instead of the approval checklist that you discussed?
No. In fact, a certificate of compliance is never acceptable to demonstrate the product has met its specifications, because by its very definition, certificate of analysis means analysis of that specific product lot, not a statement of everything we produce is in compliance. And that's what a certificate of compliance is.
Are there guidelines for how long documentation must be kept for a product, including shelf life, HACCP plans, etc.?
There is, yes, there's minimum requirements for all documents related to the manufacturing, packaging, etc. of the product, and that must be at least 1 year past the expiration date or 2 years past any records associated with production of that product. Most companies, because it's a little difficult to manage that way, they normally keep records for either 3, 4, or 5 years. Sometimes 3 doesn't quite make it. It depends on what you're producing in your operations. But that's the minimum requirement that I just mentioned.
We have one person who has a clarification question on an earlier answer. Did you say that dietary supplements cannot be drop shipped directly from a contract manufacturer to a retail customer?
if your contract manufacturer is doing everything to complete the manufacture, packaging, etc., the final sampling and demonstration that the product meets its packaged product requirements, they may not authorize the shipment of that product from their facility. Only you may do that, but you could have the arrangement established that you will review the documents they're sending to you, which they're required for you to make that release decision. Remember, we said when we looked at the FDA warning letter statements, for you to make the decision whether to distribute your product, that's always your final, that final decision is your responsibility. So you can meet that requirement to ship directly to a retailer from your CFO only after your own label distributor organization releases each lot, sends that formal release notice to the contract manufacturer, and then they could ship it to the retail outlet, yes.
Okay, it looks like that is the end of our questions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Bruce, for such an informative webinar. Our next webinar is on October 18th, and the subject is data integrity. So I encourage everyone interested to register on the EAS website. That's www.easconsultinggroup.com, and you will find our webinars listed under the Events tab. So thanks everyone again, and have a good afternoon.